The house looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed pulling into the driveway, not my husband standing on the porch, not his mother beside him, not the stack of papers pressed against her chest like a trophy she'd been waiting decades to collect. Just the house, somehow diminished in the late afternoon light, as though it already knew it no longer belonged to me. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine running. In the leather folder on the passenger seat, a copy of my grandmother Alina's will signed that morning, $7 million, the Aspen estate, her jewelry collection, her library, and 3 separate trust accounts that even her attorney seemed slightly awed by. I had driven home from that office crying so hard I had to pull over twice. Happy tears, the embarrassing kind. I kept imagining telling Daniel. I kept imagining him lifting me off the ground the way he used to, back when good news still existed between us. I turned off the engine. Patricia Whitmore was watching me from the porch with the particular expression she reserved for problems she'd already solved. Calm, patient, settled, she was wearing her good coat, the cream-colored one she only brought out for occasions she considered significant. That detail registered somewhere in the back of my mind, but I was still smiling from the will reading, still warm from Alina's attorney shaking my hand, still a woman who believed she was coming home to share the best news of her marriage. Daniel wouldn't look at me directly. He was staring somewhere past my left shoulder, the way people stare when they've rehearsed something so many times they've stopped believing it themselves. I stepped out of the car. "The house has been sold," Patricia said, just like that, the same voice she used to announce dinner reservations. "Your things are already in storage. There are papers here that need your signature." I heard the words, I understood them individually, but my brain kept rearranging them, looking for a different meaning, the way you reread a sentence that can't possibly say what it says. "Sold," I repeated. Daniel finally looked at me. "It's over, Claire." I have tried many times since to describe what happened inside me at that moment. Not screaming, not crying, something quieter and more total, the feeling of standing in a room you've lived in for years and realizing for the first time that the walls were never painted the color you thought they were. The flower pots I'd planted last April were gone from the steps. The porch swing Daniel built for our 20th anniversary was missing. Even the curtains in the front window were different, white panels I'd never seen before, already hung, already arranged as though my taste had been erased and replaced. This didn't happen in a day. That understanding arrived slowly like cold water. Patricia came down one step and extended the papers toward me. "Sign these now or sign them later, it makes no practical difference." "When were you going to tell me?" I asked. Daniel rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I looked at him carefully, at the man who once drove from Denver to Colorado Springs through a February blizzard because I had a fever and wanted soup from the one restaurant that made it properly, who carried my mother's casket photo through a crowd at her funeral because my arms were shaking too hard to hold it, who had kind eyes in 1994, genuinely kind eyes, the type that made a room feel safer. "Harder," I said softly, not a question, just the word sitting there between us. Patricia exhaled through her nose. "You'll be fine, you're resourceful." It was the kind of sentence that sounds like a compliment until you feel the blade inside it. Patricia had been offering me sentences like that for 27 years. "You're so brave to wear your hair that short." Daniel's always admired independent women up to a point. "You keep things so simple, Claire, that's actually a gift. Small, careful, deniable." Delivered with a smile refined over decades of country club lunches and charity galas, and the specific social education that teaches women how to wound each other without ever raising their voices. And every time Daniel had said, "She doesn't mean it that way." That sentence had been the quiet anthem of our marriage. I could have it engraved somewhere. A sound from the street made me turn, a truck slowing near the curb, the driver checking an address on his phone, then continuing on, "Not here yet." Patricia glanced toward the road and then back at me. "The buyers are coming, you should be gone before that." Something sharpened inside me. "The buyers," I said. "The house sold 3 days ago." Daniel's voice was carefully neutral, the voice of a man delivering information, not making a confession. 3 days ago I had been sitting beside Alina's hospital bed, holding her hand while her breathing came slow and uneven, watching the monitors, asking the nurses questions I already knew the answers to because asking them meant there was still something to be done. 3 days ago, while my grandmother was dying, my husband was finalizing the paperwork to remove me from my own life. I thought about Alina then, not the will, not the money, but her face last winter, sitting at her kitchen table in Aspen while snow accumulated on the window ledges. "Never let people rush you toward papers," she'd said. I'd laughed. She hadn't. "No," she'd said quietly, "I just sound old." I had thought she was being paranoid. I thought that a lot about Alina. She had a habit of seeing around corners that made everyone around her mildly uncomfortable until the moment she was proven right. Patricia thrust the papers slightly closer. "Claire." I looked at her hand, at the divorce papers, at the house behind her that had apparently belonged to my husband in a way I'd never quite been informed about. And then I almost told them, about Alina, about the attorney's office that morning, about the $7 million sitting quietly in accounts with my name on them, the whole beautiful reversal of it rising in my throat like something I had every right to say. But Alina's voice arrived first. "Patience is real power, the other kind is just noise." I closed my mouth. Patricia watched me with a satisfaction she wasn't bothering to conceal anymore. "You always trusted too easily," she said. "That was the problem." "Yes," I agreed. She blinked. She'd been expecting tears or argument or the particular silence of a woman who has been defeated. She wasn't expecting agreement. I looked toward the house one more time, then I looked at Daniel. "Actually," I said, "the house you sold," I paused. "I'm curious whether the buyers understand the full ownership structure." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" I said nothing else. I simply waited, the way Alina had taught me to wait, not with hostility, just with the absolute stillness of a woman who knows something the room doesn't. Patricia recovered first. She always recovered first. A short laugh, practiced and dismissive. "Don't be dramatic." But Daniel kept staring at me. After 27 years, he knew the difference between a bluff and something else. His eyes moved across my face like a man looking for the exit in a burning building. "What do you know?" he asked. Before I could answer, a black SUV turned onto our street. The older man stepped out first. He was around 70, unhurried, wearing an expensive coat in the manner of someone for whom expense had long since ceased to be a notable quality. He surveyed the scene on the porch with the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to arriving in the middle of things. His eyes found me first, not Daniel, not Patricia, me. "Interesting timing," he said to nobody in particular. Daniel moved quickly down the porch steps with his hand outstretched. "Daniel Whitmore," we spoke by phone. "Walter Bishop," the handshake was brief. Walter's attorney, younger, carrying a leather folder with the careful grip of someone who understood what was inside it, positioned himself slightly to the left. Patricia materialized beside Daniel immediately, her social smile appearing as though switched on by a circuit. "We're just finishing a family matter." Walter glanced at the divorce papers in Daniel's hand. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." Then he turned back to me. "You must be Claire." "I am." He studied me for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced an envelope, cream-colored, heavy stock. My grandmother's handwriting slanted precisely across the front. My name. I would have recognized her penmanship in a dark room. "For Claire, if Patricia finally gets her way." My chest seized. "Alina asked me to deliver this personally," Walter said, "under specific circumstances." He looked very briefly at Daniel. "She said if this house was ever transferred without your full knowledge, there would likely be confusion about who actually owned it." The silence that followed had texture. Daniel's laugh came out wrong. There's no confusion, the title was in my name." "Partially," Walter's attorney said. Just that one word, partially. I watched it hit Daniel, watched him absorb it, try to dismiss it, fail. Patricia turned to him sharply. What does he mean, partially? Daniel said nothing, which told me everything. Walter extended the envelope toward me. I took it with hands that weren't entirely steady and held my grandmother's handwriting between my fingers for a moment before opening it. The paper smelled like her, lavender, cedar, faintly of the particular tea she drank every evening. For one irrational second the whole world contracted down to that smell. Elena in her kitchen, Elena on her porch, Elena's face the last time I saw her when she was still conscious, the particular way she looked at me that I had mistaken for medication and exhaust. Tian, but now understood, had been something else entirely. Goodbye, and I've taken care of it. I read. Claire, if you're reading this, I was right to worry. I usually am, which has never made me popular at dinner parties. You have always believed that love, applied patiently enough, can correct dishonesty. This was your mother's belief also. She was wrong too, but you both came by it honestly, which is its own kind of grace. Daniel is not cruel by nature. Weak men become dangerous not through malice but through the slow surrender of their judgment to whoever speaks loudest and most consistently near them. You know who speaks loudest. 6 years ago, when the business was failing, I helped. Not because I trusted Daniel, but because I trusted what losing everything would do to you. I structured that help carefully. I had excellent lawyers. I suggest you call Walter. I looked up. Patricia was watching me with an expression that had shifted into something I had never seen on her face before in 27 years of Christmases and anniversary dinners and quiet wars conducted over the extended family table. Fear, real, specific, unmanaged fear. Give me that, she said, stepping forward. Walter's attorney moved smoothly between us. Mrs. Whitmore. She stopped. She was not accustomed to being stopped by people she hadn't approved. Daniel's voice came out thin. Claire, what does it say? It says, Walter answered before I could, that 6 years ago, when Mr. Whitmore's financial difficulties required outside assistance, Mrs. Elena Bennett structured that assistance through a protected trust with a partial ownership interest in this property. The fireplace in Daniel's face went out. What percentage? He said quietly. Enough, Walter said, that selling it without full disclosure to all parties creates very serious legal complications for the buyers. He looked toward Patricia, and for whoever arranged the timeline. Patricia's composure cracked, just a hairline fracture, a flinch behind the eyes, but I'd spent 27 years watching her face, and I knew what her composure looked like when it was working versus when it was being maintained by force. Daniel, her voice came out sharp, what did you sign 6 years ago? There were hundreds of pages. You told me to move fast. I told you to read. You told me the refinancing had to close by Friday, or we'd lose the line of credit. Don't, her voice dropped, don't make this my. You handled all of it. The sentence hung in the cold air between them, and in the silence after it, I watched something fundamental shift between my husband and his mother. Watched the alliance crack along a fault line that had probably always been there, invisible until the weight became too much. Walter looked at me gently. There's more to the letter. I looked back down. The second envelope is for after the hotel conversation if it gets that far. Walter will explain. He's been my attorney for 30 years and I trust him entirely, which is something I can say about very few people. You should be one of them. Patricia has always underestimated you because you are quiet. Quiet women confuse people who only understand noise. That confusion has historically worked in their favor. Let it work in yours. Your grandmother, who loved you without conditions or asterisks. I folded the letter, held it, pressed it once against my chest like I was pressing it against something I needed to protect. Walter's voice came gently. There's a hotel nearby with a private room. I think we should continue there. Patricia straightened immediately. There is nothing to continue. This is harassment. Mom, Daniel's voice. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, not anger exactly, but something underneath anger. the expression of a man who has been staring at the same painting his whole life and has just, in the wrong light at the wrong angle, finally seen what it actually depicts. "Stop talking," he said quietly. Patricia opened her mouth, closed it. And in 60 seconds, Daniel had done something he hadn't managed in 27 years. The hotel lounge was warm and dim, mostly occupied by couples eating early dinners and families grateful to be out of the cold. Walter reserved a corner table near the fireplace. His attorney spread documents across the polished surface with the careful precision of someone laying out evidence they'd spent months organizing. Which it turned out is exactly what it was. The second envelope contained a letter, but also photocopies, bank transfers, property records, a sequence of emails printed on Alina's personal letterhead with certain passages underlined in her distinctive red ink. She had been meticulous. She had been building this for years. Every time she sent me a birthday card or called to ask how I was sleeping, she had also been quietly, methodically, constructing a legal shelter around me that I hadn't known existed until I needed to step inside it. I sat with the documents in my lap and felt something enormous and complex moving through me. Not triumph, it wasn't clean enough for that. Something closer to grief and gratitude occupying the same space at the same time, the way they do when someone who loved you has died but left behind evidence of just how much. "You used my mother's money," I said. Daniel looked up from the page he'd been staring at. "During the recession, you told me you pulled from your savings." I held up one of the photocopied transfers. "This is the account she left me." "Claire, how much?" Silence. "Daniel." Most of it, his voice came out barely above a whisper. 80,000, almost all of it. I was going to replace it. The business was supposed to recover by. "You replaced it with Patricia's investment accounts," Walter's attorney said, reading from a document. "Accounts which subsequently suffered significant losses following a series of high-risk decisions." The silence afterward had a very specific quality. The kind of silence that arrives when a story that has been told one way for years is suddenly retold from a different angle, and nothing in the new version can be made to fit the old one. Daniel turned toward his mother. Patricia was sitting very still in a way that was different from her normal stillness, which was the comfortable stillness of a woman in control of a room. This stillness was calculated. She was measuring exits. "You told me those accounts were protected," Daniel said. "They were structured conservatively," Patricia said carefully. "You moved money out of them. I managed them. That is not the same thing." She looked at him with a patience that was no longer warm, the patience of a woman recalibrating, deciding what she could still salvage. "Daniel, now is not the time to." "When is the time? When is the time, Mom?" His voice was louder now. Around the lounge, the early dinner couples were studying their menus with increasing intensity. "You pushed this. You told me the timing was right. You said Claire would never know about the trust because the trust didn't matter, you said." "And who signed the papers?" She leaned forward slightly. "I didn't sign anything, you did." It was devastating in its precision. Whatever she'd lost tonight, she still had this, the ability to locate the exact pressure point in a conversation and apply weight to it without blinking. Daniel sat back. The fight went out of him the way air goes out of something punctured. I had watched this pattern my entire marriage, had spent years trying to understand why a fundamentally decent man repeatedly chose his mother's approval over his own conscience. But sitting there in the firelight, watching the transaction happening in real time, his doubt, her redirection, his collapse, her satisfaction, I finally understood it wasn't a choice Daniel made actively. It was simply the only world he knew how to live in. That realization didn't make me forgive him, but it made the anger quieter, replaced it with something that felt uncomfortably like sadness. Walter spoke carefully. "At minimum, the buyers were not informed of active trust entanglements. That creates grounds for the sale to be challenged. Depending on intent and timing, there may also be questions about financial disclosure during divorce proceedings." He looked at Patricia. "For both parties." Patricia's composure finally fully broke. This is absurd. Her voice came out too sharp, stripped of its usual polish. We are not going to let some old woman's paranoid paperwork. My grandmother, I said quietly, was the least paranoid person I've ever known. She looked at me. She simply paid attention, I said. For years she paid attention, and she wrote things down. Patricia looked away first. In 27 years she had never once looked away from me first. Walter slid the second letter across the table. I opened it slowly. If you've reached the hotel conversation, then everything went roughly as I expected, which means Patricia has frightened Daniel into doing something that cannot be easily undone and is now attempting to manage the consequences from a position of diminishing control. This is her pattern. You've seen it for years. Here is what I want you to understand. You do not owe either of them resolution tonight. You do not owe Daniel comfort because he looks frightened. You do not owe Patricia acknowledgement because she has finally revealed herself clearly. You owe them the truth delivered calmly and nothing further. The estate in Aspen is yours outright. The trust provisions Walter will explain are yours. The $7 million is yours. None of this was luck. I spent years making it so. I loved your grandfather for 41 years. He was a good man who made me better. When he died, I spent a decade learning how to exist alone, which I recommend to you not as punishment but as education. There is a version of yourself you have never been allowed to meet. Go meet her. With all my love. Alina. I folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in my bag. Daniel's hand moved across the table toward mine. I let him almost reach me before I moved my hand to my lap. Claire, his voice broke slightly. I'm sorry, I know that doesn't. I know you're sorry. I looked at him directly. I believe you. He waited for what came after that, for the forgiveness or the negotiation or the door I'd always left open in the past. I didn't offer any of them. You sold our house while I was at my grandmother's will reading, I said. 3 days after she died, while I was holding her hand in a hospital, you were signing papers to remove me from my own life. That is what happened, and saying you're sorry doesn't make a different thing happen instead. Daniel pressed his fingers to his eyes. Patricia stood abruptly. This conversation is over. Sit down, Walter said without raising his voice. She sat. She seemed as surprised by it as anyone. The buyers are aware as of this afternoon that the sale is legally complicated, Walter continued. They've been advised to pause all proceedings pending review. Daniel, I would strongly suggest you and your attorney discuss your options before midnight because the window for a clean resolution narrows significantly after that. He glanced at Patricia. I'd suggest the same for Mrs. Whitmore, who may want to be represented separately given that her interests are no longer identical to her son's. Patricia looked at Daniel, then at me, then at Walter. For the first time in the evening, she said nothing. I picked up my bag, stood. Daniel rose immediately. Where are you going? Aspen. Tonight. My grandmother's house is mine now. It has a study she used to sit in and a porch with a view of the mountains and a caretaker named Benji who knew her for 30 years and will probably want to talk about her. I looked at Daniel one final time. I need to go be somewhere I'm not a problem to be managed. I didn't wait for his answer. I walked toward the hotel entrance while behind me Patricia's voice rose in sharp, urgent tones, directing and redirecting, working the situation with the tenacity of someone who has never once considered that the situation might have already escaped her. Outside, the cold was clean and absolute. It smelled like pine and coming snow. Walter appeared beside me. His driver was already waiting. She planned all of this, I said, not a question. For years, Walter confirmed. She watched your marriage carefully, Mrs. Harper. She understood Patricia Whitmore better than most people did because she recognized the type. He paused. She also understood that telling you directly wouldn't have worked. You would have defended him. He wasn't wrong. She said once, Walter added quietly, that the kindest thing she could do was make sure you had somewhere to land when you finally stopped catching him. I stood with that for a moment in the cold night air. Then I got in the car. Aspen was silver and silent when we arrived after 2 a.m. Fresh snow had covered the long driveway, and the estate sat at the top of it with warm light in the windows as though it had been waiting. Benji met me at the gate, older than I remembered, but with the same unhurried steadiness he'd always had. "Miss Claire," he opened the car door carefully, "I'm sorry about your grandmother." Those words of everything that had happened in the past 14 hours, the papers, the house, the hotel, Walter's documents, Patricia's face when she finally understood, those 4 words were what finally undid me. Just for a moment, just long enough. Because all of it had been about property and money and legal structure. Nobody had said her name like she was a person. I stood in the cold and cried briefly, the way you cry when you've been holding something much too long. Then I went inside. Eleanor's house was exactly as she'd left it, the grandfather clock in the hallway, the kitchen that still smelled of cinnamon, her knitted blanket folded over the arm of the chair by the fireplace where she'd left it, where I would leave it for a long time before I could bring myself to move it. I found the final letter in her study, sitting on the center of her desk as though placed there this morning. Of course, she had always believed important things required preparation. "Claire, first, breathe, you've forgotten to do that properly for years. Second, you are going to be tempted to feel guilty about what happens to Daniel. This is a predictable response from a woman who spent 3 decades absorbing the discomfort of everyone around her and calling it love. It is not love. Love is not the same as absorbing damage quietly until you disappear. I watched you disappear, inch by inch, year by year. The woman I raised to ask hard questions learned to make herself very small in that house. I should have said something sooner. That is my failure and I will carry it. What I can tell you is this: real love does not ask you to become less. It does not require you to maintain the peace by staying silent. It does not hand you a permanent role as the one who adjusts. You have a life ahead of you that belongs entirely to you, not to Daniel's moods or Patricia's architecture or a marriage that was decided by committee without your knowledge. In the top drawer of my desk, the journal I kept for the last 8 years. I want you to read it when you're ready, not tonight, when you're ready. The porch swing is the best place to think. Early morning before the valley wakes up, when the light comes over the mountains and the air is cold enough to make you feel alive. That was always my favorite hour. I expect it will be yours too. All my love, every last bit of it, is yours. Eleanor. I sat in her chair for a long time after that. Outside, snow fell quietly and the mountains held still. Then I opened the desk drawer and looked at the journal with my name on the cover, and I left it there for later, the way she'd asked. The phone calls started 2 days later. Daniel first, repeatedly, the particular frequency of a man discovering that silence from someone who has always responded feels like a physical wall. Then his attorney. Then once a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Patricia's new lawyer, who left a very professional voicemail that contained nothing useful and communicated, in its careful legal language, that things had deteriorated significantly at the other end. I let Walter handle it. What I did instead, I walked through Eleanor's property in the snow. I cooked badly in her kitchen and improved slowly. I read her books and left notes in the margins, having arguments with her across time. I called Mary Ann, my oldest friend, who cried on the phone and then flew out 2 weeks later and stayed for 10 days, during which she ate all of Eleanor's stored preserves and refused to apologize for it. I read the journal when I was ready. It took 3 weeks to be ready. It was not what I expected. It wasn't a list of grievances. It wasn't evidence or accusation. It was just observations, the kind a very careful person makes when they love someone and worry about them. Claire apologizes for things that aren't her fault. This is a pattern worth watching. Daniel defers to Patricia before answering questions that should require no consultation. Claire laughed today at dinner and then checked his face to see if it was all right. She didn't notice she did it. That last entry was from 4 years ago. I read it 3 times. She didn't notice she did it. I put the journal down and sat for a while with the window open, cold air moving through the room, the mountains doing what mountains do, existing without explanation or apology, simply taking up their rightful space. I had spent 30 years making myself small in rooms to avoid displacing anyone. I had refined the adjustment until it became invisible, even to myself, until checking whether my own laugh was acceptable had become as automatic as breathing. That was the thing about surviving a particular kind of long-term unhappiness. You don't notice the shape it's made you into until you're somewhere different, standing in different light. 1 year later, I was still in that different light. Mary Ann burned the dinner rolls. It was December, almost exactly 12 months since I'd stood in my own driveway holding my purse and smiling about news I never got to share. The dining table was full. Mary Ann, Walter and his wife, Benji and his daughter, 2 friends from Denver I hadn't spoken to properly in years. The fire was going. Wine had been opened. Someone had put jazz on the record player, Eleanor's jazz, because it turned out her taste was correct about almost everything. The rolls came out of the oven black on the bottom, and Mary Ann carried them to the table with such dignity that no one said anything for a full 10 seconds before Walter started laughing and couldn't stop. "I'll buy better rolls," Mary Ann announced. "You will do nothing of the sort," Benji said. "We will eat these rolls and be grateful." "Benji," Walter said, "you are the bravest man I know." I sat at the head of Eleanor's table, my table now. I was still learning to think of it that way, and watched the people I loved argue about incinerated bread in the warm light of a house that felt, genuinely and without complication, like home. Daniel had written twice. The first letter, 5 months ago, was long, apologies structured carefully, regrets catalogued with the thoroughness of a man who has recently had a great deal of quiet time to review his decisions. I read it once and put it away. The second letter was shorter. He said the business was gone. He said most of their friends had quietly receded. He said Patricia had hired her own lawyers and that the experience of watching someone you spent your life protect themselves from you instead was instructive. The last line said, "Your grandmother understood people better than I gave her credit for." I wrote nothing back, not because I was punishing him. I'd moved past punishment months ago, somewhere on a cold morning walk when I realized anger requires continued proximity and I was no longer proximate to any of it. I wrote nothing back because I had nothing I needed to say. That was a distinction I'd had to learn, the difference between a silence that is avoidance and a silence that is simply completion. After dinner, after everyone had gone, I went outside. The porch swing was there. Walter had tracked it down after the house sale collapsed. Daniel had sold it separately, apparently to a neighbor, and had it delivered to Aspen as what he called a small act of justice and what Benji called a good joke. I sat on it in Eleanor's old coat, wool and cedar scented, and looked out at the mountains holding their shapes patiently in the dark. Somewhere in the valley below, Aspen glowed, above it stars. I thought about the woman who had sat here every morning before the valley woke up, watching the light come over the mountains, making her notes and writing her letters and constructing her patient, quiet protections, who had loved me without conditions or asterisks, her words, who had seen everything I couldn't see about my own life and decided that the most useful thing she could do was not save me from it, but make sure I had somewhere to land when I finally saved myself. The swing moved gently in the cold. For years I thought home was a person, a marriage, a shared history, a man who promised to stay. I know now that I was wrong about that, or not wrong exactly, just incomplete. Home is where you are allowed to take up your full space, where your laugh doesn't need permission, where the quiet is peaceful instead of dangerous, where the person most responsible for your well-being is, finally and without apology, you. Eleanor had known that, had been trying to show me for years. I was a slow student, but I got there. The mountains were still, the snow was clean, the night smelled like pine and cold and everything beginning. I stayed on the porch until I got cold, and then I went inside.